Hi there, everybody. Welcome back. Today we are going to talk a little bit about color theory, and color theory is specifically in how it relates to Photoshop. Now, if you have taken any other art classes or are in the process of taking art classes, hopefully you might know a little bit about color theory. But if not, that's fine. We're going to go through it some today. Now, make sure you listen closely. There is going to be a quiz at the end of this, a short quiz. So let's get right into it. Okay, so the first thing I kind of want to show you is the color wheel. Now, color theory is obviously going to be all about the color wheel and how the colors kind of relate to each other. As you notice, the main three colors here are the red, blue, and yellow. And as the red and the blue mix, you'll notice that it moves to purple. As the blue and the yellow mix, it turns to green. And as the yellow and the red mix, it turns to orange. And then it just kind of radiates out from there. So as the yellow and the orange mix, you get yellow orange. And as the red and the orange mix, you get red on orange, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of notice how all the colors kind of relate to each other, all beginning with those basic primary colors, which are red, yellow, and blue. Colors are generally changed with hue, saturation, and value. Um, Hue is the basic hue, the basic color. So if you go back, hues are going to be your reds, your blues, your yellow, your green, your orange. All of those are different hues. Saturation is how much or how little of that color is actually in that hue. So as you subtract color, it's going to get a little more dull. And as you add color, it's going to get more vibrant, as it is here on the top. Value, on the other hand, is the lightness or darkness of a color. So if you add black, it's going to get darker. If you add white, it's going to get lighter. So in addition to those three, hue, saturation, and value, there's also tint, tone, and shade. So tint is any hue or mixture with white added. So if you notice over there with the value, if it's going up on the value. Tone is if you are mixing any of your pure colors with gray. So this is equal amounts of black and white. And then shade is anything with black added in. So tint has got white, tone has got gray, and shade has black only. And also, tone is sometimes used for two meanings. One meaning, one is the meaning above, and the other one is kind of a balance between saturation and value. So here's just another visualization of that. So tint, if you notice, the very first circle on that is a pure red. And then adding a little bit of white makes it pink. Adding a little bit more white makes it a lighter pink. Shade, on the other hand, is you have your main in the middle. Then you're going to add black, and it's going to get a little more darker. And then black again, and it almost turns to like a pretty dark maroon color. And then tone is when you're adding gray, and you can notice that it kind of gets a little dull as you move it down the line. Here's just another representation of that. We have our hues on the very top. And then if you notice, if you add white, it becomes a tint. If you add gray, it kind of becomes a little more dull. If you add white, it tends to be a little lighter, a little brighter. If you add gray, it kind of tends to be a little more dull. And then if you add black, it kind of turns darker. So you can kind of notice those differences. So so this is just another great example of how the tone works with the color. So as you notice on the bottom, there is a saturation level. So with a very high saturation, you'll get that vivid color. And that's really the pure color. And then as you kind of lower the saturation, lower the shade, and increase the tint, you'll notice that it changes color. So as you go down on the shade, down on the value, you'll come to very dark, dark, deep, very dark. And then if you go up to the top and add more light in the value, you'll get very, very pale, pale light, and so on and so forth. When you get into Photoshop, you'll notice that you have these options to kind of manipulate the color in Photoshop. So we have cyan and red, magenta and green, and yellow and blue. When you're kind of thinking about looking at a screen versus printing, there are two different color spaces that can be used. RGB is really more for something like a monitor or a screen or digital output that you're going to look at. So if you're thinking about RGB means red, green, and blue. And it's really for things that emit light. So the light is coming from behind the screen and pushing through the light. The big difference here is that it's an additive color. So the more color you add to it, the brighter it gets. And all the colors together, you get white right in the middle. In contrast, if you are printing something, if you are putting it on a printed piece of paper, you really want to use CMYK. So CMYK is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And those are the main pieces that are used for that. And so you're going to see something like this because instead of emitting light or pushing through light, this one is really absorbing light. So it's called a subtractive color palette. And the more colors you add, the darker it gets because the pigment on the printed material absorbs the light. So if you are working in Photoshop as we are here, we're really working in an RGB space. Now, if you have a picture that is going to be printed, it will need to be switched to a CMYK space. But if you're working on anything that is going to be on a screen or in video or anything like that, you're going to work on an RGB space. These are really important to know the difference for, especially if you're working in Photoshop. There's been many times in my career where somebody made something in RGB space and it ended up getting printed and the colors were all sorts of crazy because they weren't using the right color space. So it's really important to make sure you're using the right color space. But most of the time, if you're working in Photoshop, which is on a digital platform, you're going to be using RGB. So you can change the mode in Photoshop. That's the great thing about this is you can actually go in and you can change the mode to what you need it to be. But you cannot get back the original color of RGB even though you change it back. So you have to make sure that you save the original file before you change it to CMYK. So we're going to talk a little bit about chroma, intensity, or saturation. They're all kind of the same meaning, but basically it's meaning the brightness of the color. So it's kind of what I said right in the beginning. It's the amount of color that is in there. So if you look at this color wheel, we have a lot of green. So cyan and yellow, that's blue and yellow. They're going to mix together to make green. If you look at the very top one, maybe on the 11 o'clock on your dial, it is 100% cyan, 100% yellow, and 0% black. And you can see that this is a really saturated color. This is really full, and there's really no other change you can make to this. In contrast, if you look at the one right next to it, it's only got 15% cyan, 15% yellow, and 0% black. And so what you see is it's a much lighter, much paler color, and it's more like it's just much paler. So it just depends on how much of that color is put in there, is how saturated it is. So this is a great representation of value. If you look right in the middle, there's a line that's really your true hue. So the very middle part. Now, if you look to one side, you're going to see that really they become a little whiter as you add white to it. So that's adding lightness. And then if you go to the other side, you're adding darkness. And so that's really the value of it. A lot of times things work really great if the values are the same, but that can really change the way color looks. Value in contrast to saturation is a little bit different. Saturation, again, is going to be something where you're going to add more color, but value is really adding black or white. So there's a big difference there. As you notice here, there are lots of different ways in Photoshop to change it, to be able to get to something that you can really change all of your color and really play with the colors to see what's going to work best for you. So here's a representation of how value looks in the color window. So, what I'd like to do at this point is I'd like to go ahead and open up Photoshop and kind of show you where you can find these things in Photoshop. So give me one moment. So again, here's my Photoshop palette. As I'm kind of working in Photoshop, if I can't find what I need to find, just remember, if you go up to Window, this will give you kind of a workspace that you could go to. Also, it'll give you all of your panels that you can use. Today, I'm going to show you a little bit about the color panel, which is this one right over here. And I'm going to go ahead and pull it out so that we can look at it a little closer. You can resize your color palette to kind of look any way you need it to look. But this is a really helpful tool. As we notice again, here's where we have full saturation. If we add lightness, we're changing the value. If we add darkness, we're changing the value. Here's our hues right over here, so we can change it to whatever hue we need to. But this is a great way to kind of play with some of your colors. So as you're looking at your color palette, there's a little hamburger menu here. We call it a hamburger because it's got all the little lines. We're going to click on that, and at this point, you can actually look at several different ways to look at the color wheel. So you can look at a hue cube, which is what we have right here, a brightness cube, which is really what we're using for adding brightness. So if you go down, you can change the value of it, or you can change it going down over here. It's a great way. The next one is the color wheel. This one's really fun because you can change your hue right here. You can change your saturation level, and you can change your amount of black that you're adding to it. This is also really great because you can just click on it and move it around wherever you need to be in here. Okay, there are also your grayscale slider, and this is using one that's more like adding that tonal value to it, right? We have RGB sliders, so how much red, green, and blue are in your palette. We have CMYK sliders. There's your hue, saturation, and blackness sliders. It's web color. So you have a lot of different choices over here. You can also go in here and get hex codes and all sorts of other things. Right now we're on the CMYK spectrum, so if you want to change it to RGB, you can see that there's a huge difference in those color palettes. So although it looks really bright on the screen, when you print RGB, it'll look a little crazy. So I can give you a really good difference in those two. Anyway, there's a lot of different choices. I honestly always use the hue cube, but I know a lot of people who like the color wheel. You can choose whichever one works easiest for you, and work on changing whichever one you need to change. Okay, this is just another representation of hue, saturation, and value. So as you notice on the very top on the round part, there is all your different hues. Your saturation is how much color is in those hues, and your value is the darkness and lightness of the hue. All right, next we're going to talk about the basic color schemes. There are lots of different color combinations. We are only going to focus on these 5 for right now. We have our complementary color, which is across the color wheel. We have analogous, which are right next to each other on the color wheel. We have triadic, which are equidistant in a triangle on the color wheel. We have split complementary, which are just next to the complementary ones. And we have a tetradic, which is a square that is basically 2 complementary colors. So the very first one that we're going to talk about is complementary, or as it's referred to here as direct harmony. And this is kind of the most basic one that we have. It is exactly opposite on the color wheel, and it's just directly across. So virtually all color harmonies are a variation of a direct harmony. So complementary color schemes are a little tricky because in large doses they can cause some crazy things to happen. And one of those things is called halation. If you notice here, this is a perfect example. This photo is perfectly complementary. So we have the orange and the blue. One of the hardest things that happens though is because these colors are so fully saturated, they tend to be almost painful to look at. They really tend to fight with each other, and they really are not pleasant for the eye. So one of the things that happens when you have something like this where it's really, really saturated colors is you have something that's called halation. So halation is kind of shown over here. If you kind of look at it and you squint your eyes just a little bit, you'll notice that these colors almost look like they are shades. So if I were to look at the middle color, for example, if you'll notice, the left hand side of the color almost looks like it's a little lighter than the right hand side of that color. And that's because of something called halation, when in reality it's just one solid color. So it tends to play some tricks on your eyes. And it really hurts sometimes to look at. Over here you can see we have a full split complementary colors, and they can be really unpleasant to look at, and it almost makes your eyes just have a lot of motion. This is definitely not something that you want to do on purpose. Now, there are times that color or complementary colors can work really well, and this is one of those times. So if you notice, this is a great movie poster. We have our complementary colors are that blue color and the brown color. But what makes it work really well is that it is broken up by the dark black color. So even though the car we see has got that brown color, the type has that blue color, it works because they're not kind of competing with each other. And they're not right next to each other. So you have a little bit of black that's kind of breaking it up. So it actually makes it really pleasing to your eye. Here's another one just like that. In this one, they're using different shades and tones and values to kind of create this palette. So even though the colors are right next to each other, they're not so overwhelming for the viewer to take in, because they're kind of broken up with some other hues and values, some lights and darks. It really helps you to where your eyes aren't in pain. All right, the next one that we're going to talk about is the split complementary colors. So this, as you notice, the complementary color for that red is going to be the green right below it. So the split complementary colors are the ones right next to the complementary color. It also has a strong visual contrast as the complementary color, but there's less tension in between it. This is kind of a sage choice for virtually any design. You can't really mess it up that much, so it's used pretty often. Here's a great example of that. This is another movie poster. If you notice, we have this split complementary. We have the orange and the blue and the green. So the orange is really your main choice over here. So we have the skin color and the jacket, and then the background is where we see that little bit of blue and green. And so it becomes a really pleasing look because they are split complementary, but also because that warm color is kind of pushed to the front and the cool colors are pushed to the back. So it really brings out the subject of this, and it also helps create a really strong composition. Okay, the next one we're going to talk about is the analogous harmony. So this is really referred to as related colors. So they're colors directly to the left and the right of your key color. They usually match up really well and create something that's a really comfortable design. It can also come across a little bit as monotone, but if you're going for a design that is primarily one color, this is a great choice to do that with. So here's another great example of that. If you notice, we have blue, purple, and light purple or pink. And they're right next to each other on the color wheel. with just a little bit of lightness added to it or less saturation. And so it does a really great job with that black base of creating something that's really pleasing and easy to look at and really comfortable. Okay, the next one here is a triadic harmony. This is also referred to as triadics or triads. And basically these are each equidistant from each other on the color wheel. They are stretching the basic. A lot of times the main one for this is the red, blue, and yellow, which are your primary colors. They are your best, they are your most, widely known triadic harmony. The one thing about these, they work really great, but if you have too much of each color, it can be too vibrant. It can be too much. If you kind of let one dominate and let the other two kind of accent, that's the better way to do this one. So here's a great example of that. This is a Superman poster. We have our red, blue, and yellow. And if you notice, the only main part, besides a little bit of accent on his skin, the main part that you see, the yellow, is in the Superman logo. And so it really does a great job of accenting the Superman logo and kind of just bringing it into focus. But it's not too much to where it kind of hurts your eyes. And if you notice too, like there is a black background on this, and so it helps kind of mute those colors, because if it was just pure red, blue, and yellow, it would be too much and it would not be very comfortable to look at. In contrast, here's another one, but it has a white background, but it also has the red and the blue, and then just a touch of yellow. There are some yellow shades in the background, but really the main yellow is what you're seeing in the type. But it's just the right amount of each color to really make it pleasant to look at. But if you notice, it's kind of broken up with this white base. And that can really make a difference in the way something feels too. Like if you're adding a white base like this one here, it kind of feels light and airy. Whereas if you're adding a dark background like this one right here, it tends to feel more heavy and more weighted and almost a little more gloomy. And so you can really change the way something feels. Even though they have the same colors, you can change the way something feels just by adding dark or white. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is the tetradic harmony. The main thing to know about this is that there's going to be four spaces on the color wheel. They're mainly going to be in a square or a rectangle, but the main deal about them is it's two pairs of complementary colors. So however those work out, you're using two sets of complementary colors. This is good when you have lots of elements that need to stand out on their own, such as a poster that has 4 or more characters, or if you're using the colors like equally distant on the color wheel, each character gets its own attention. A great example of that is this movie poster, the Inside Out movie poster. So even though we have all of these colors happening, number one, they're kind of broken up by the black, which helps really clean it up a little bit. But each piece has its own color scheme, which kind of sets it apart. And it works really well for this movie poster. Now, if you had all of these colors working all together, and it could get a little much, but this is a really good use and representation of the tetradic harmony. All right, we're going to just do a couple more advanced color combinations before we wrap up this lecture. Um, these are just a couple of extras that I just wanted to make sure to go over too. This one over here, this French word camille or monochromatic. So basically, this is different hues of the same color. So it's one color, uh, just a little bit of uh, different additions or subtractions. So this is a great example of that. You have your green and you're just adding black or white, so it's different values. So if you look at this rose, um, we have this interior designer that has created a room with these colors. If you notice, we have our rose polka, and it's just different colors. So you take out some more of that saturation and you get that kind of gray pinky color, or you can have a rose color, and it becomes really calming. And it sometimes I think can become really boring, but in this case here, it's really calming and kind of wants you to sit in that room. The next one is kind of using the two colors next to each other, but also in different hues. So here you can see we have the blue and the green, and there's just a little different tone to those greens. And so it creates a different. So the other thing about color is that color can often evoke feelings, um, and the proportion of that color can really change the way a piece of artwork is viewed or felt. It really can make a big difference. So, oftentimes in design and in art, artists choose specific colors based on how the feeling is that they kind of evoke. So a lot of times red can be seen as anger, whereas green can be seen as calming. Blue can be seen as kind of a sad piece, and yellow is kind of a happy. So you can really change the feeling of your artwork depending on what kind of color you use. So here's a really great example of some of those. So black is kind of a sophistication, power, mystery, formality. You'll see a lot of formal things in black. Whereas green, for example, you'll find growth, the environment. You see a lot of this in like recycling logos or things of that nature. Red is excitement, urgency, energetic. You'll find this a lot in like emergency rooms or even in a stop sign, danger. Um, Blue is more like peace or stability or calmness, confidence. You'll find this more in logos that are like, um, are trying to convey that in some way, stability. So you'll even like in a Microsoft, you'll find those blues. So anyway, there's a lot of great things here about that. So as you work on kind of creating your artwork in the future, thinking about this is important, because it can really change the way your artwork is viewed. Another thing that can change it is the proportion of each color. So if you notice in the first square, all of the colors have the same proportion. And so it has a very different feel than the one right next to it that has mostly peach, or the one below it that has mostly green. So you can change the way a piece of artwork feels just by changing the proportion in the colors. And this is especially true in things like if you're using like that Superman poster, There were red, green, and yellow, but there was just a small amount of yellow, so it's an accent color. It's just enough to really pop in a little bit of color instead of having the whole thing as that. So here's another kind of representation of how that works. So if you notice on that very first square, we have all the different colors and everything kind of takes up the same amount of room. Um, and so, it kind of feels pretty heavy. In contrast, if you look at the last one, the blue is kind of the heaviest part, and so it makes it feel more open, more airy. It makes it have a totally different feeling than the first one. So the proportions really make a difference in how it feels. Here's another one where the proportions make a big difference. They are the same colors on both sides, but the proportions of the one to the right are much bigger than the one to the left. And the one to the left actually feels a lot more lighter, where the one to the right feels more heavier. So in a lot of times when somebody's doing a piece of artwork or a piece of design or a photo or however, there's always going to be a dominant color, a subdominant colors, and then an accent color. And it just is the proportionate amount that are in the photo. So if you notice, the accent color is just a little pop of color, just enough to add that little bit of extra that'll bring in those colors. So this is a great example of this. Most of the color in this photo is blue because of the walls. But if you notice, the designer very specifically put pops of yellow and pops of black in this, which really makes a difference and really makes it aesthetically pleasing. Here's another piece of artwork that's very intentional. Most of it is blue, but then there are all those little pops of yellow that are popping out that make a difference in the way that it's viewed. It makes it very calming. Okay, this is another kind of important part that color kind of plays into. When looking at color, the color around it really helps determine what the viewer can see. If you notice, both of these bars in these boxes are actually gray. They're actually the same color gray. But because the colors around it are different, so we have green and purple, they affect the way those colors look to us. This is true at any level. The color on the outside will always affect the way the color looks. So a lot of times you'll notice, or people will notice, that if you're painting a painting or if you're doing something like that, they may begin with kind of a toned canvas or a gray toned canvas or a neutral tone, so that those colors, they can see them correctly. So it does make a huge difference on how you notice colors. Another thing that makes a difference is the coolness or the warmness of your colors. So this is a great example over here. There are two spheres. The one to the left has more of a yellow tone, which is more of a warmer tone. You'll notice this in most of the things that you have if you're outside in the sun, or sometimes some of the lights. In contrast, the one on the right is a cooler tone. So you'll notice that there's more blues. It feels colder. It feels more cleaner in a lot of ways. So you'll notice this a lot if, like, you're looking at a photo, a photo taken in the snow is going to look a lot different than a photo taken on the beach. Because in the snow, the white is going to bring in a lot of those cooler colors. So it makes a big difference in how your photo is viewed too. And the very last part of this, I just want to kind of take a quick moment and look at this piece of artwork. This is the same piece of artwork all the way across the board. The only main difference is the colors being used. So if you notice, like the second one on the top level, there's just a little pop of color, just a little bit of accent, and it kind of brings the focus into that accent. Whereas if you look at the one at the very end, it's really light and muted and airy, and not so dark. So it really does make a difference what kind of colors you choose for your artwork. It changes the way it feels, and it changes the way it's perceived by the viewer. So my hope is that as you kind of move through this class and move through future courses, whether it be photography, game design, interior design, any of that, graphic design, that you really think about color as you kind of create your pieces, because it really does make a difference. Okay, next step is to take the quiz, and then we'll move on to other projects. Have a good one.